And by honouring the Magpies who served, we honour all who served. And that is what ANZAC Day is all about.
We're here this morning to pay our respects to not only the Australians who have fought and fell in the Great Wars and all wars and peacekeeping operations since, but also to the players, past players who have served and died, making the ultimate sacrifice. But I just want to take you through a few numbers. You know, sport and football is about numbers, and I just want to take you through a few numbers that for you to contemplate just around World War I and the seriousness of what those young men were and women who were going off to France were up against. In 1914, the Australian population was not quite 4 million people. Around 500,000 Australians of eligible age and fitness enlisted to go and fight. Of those nearly 500,000, 60,000 were killed and 170,000 were wounded. And there was another nearly 10,000 who were never found or were POWs. So they're stunning numbers. 1 in every 2 Australians of eligible age and fitness, they picked only the strongest people initially for World War II, served overseas, and 1 in 6 were killed or wounded. They're staggering numbers, really, when you think about it. Collingwood played a role and many went off to fight. So we should all take great pride in the fact that the jumper that you wear and the names on the jumper have an origin story in World War I and the battlefield of France as well.
But just to back up a little bit about what you're saying about the confluence and the importance of sport in war, that photo that's up on the screen at the moment was taken in the first ever game of Australian football that was played overseas, and that was played in wartime in London in 1916. And that guy there is Dan Minogue, who was Collingwood's captain at the time. It just backs up what Harry was saying about how the footballers, how the soldiers just loved to play sport whenever they could. It might be hard to believe given the prominence that the ANZAC Day matches have these days, but back when they started in 1995, nobody really knew what to expect from them. We didn't really know who we were honouring then. We knew what we were honouring, but not who. We knew that 10 Magpies had died at war, but we didn't know how many had served, let alone any of their stories. Fortunately, we've come a long way since then. We now know that 61 Magpies served in the First World War, 145 in the Second, and as I say, 10 died across both conflicts. And we've been able, particularly with the ANZACs, to tell their stories, to make sure that they're not just names on a list, that we know more about who these people were and their backstories, and also what happened to them afterwards sometimes. Because we, as a footy club, decided that one of the ways we could honour these people and what they did and the sacrifices they made was to tell their stories, was to keep their stories alive. Our main story starts with a great Collingwood figure called Doc Seddon. Malcolm Seddon was his proper name, everybody called him Doc. Landed at Collingwood in 1911. When he got there, there was another guy from Bendigo called Paddy Rowan. His real name was Percy Rowe. The two of them became friends almost instantly, hit it off like brothers, did everything together, played cricket together, played footy together, hung out together. We skip forward a couple of years to 1915. By now, the First World War is in full swing and the world has completely turned upside down for everybody. A Collingwood player named Alan Cordner was one of the very first footballers to enlist. He was also one of the very first to die. On that first morning at Gallipoli, he was in the first wave of soldiers that came up the beach and over the hills, and he perished that morning. But that didn't deter other Magpies or other footballers from enlisting. Paddy and Doc, of course, enlisted on the same day together and were determined to be part of the same battalion as well. But somehow when all this football was still going on, teams were dropping out, but footy was still being played. We finished that year on top of the ladder. got to play in a grand final against Carlton. At that point, Dan, Doc and Paddy were all in camp preparing to go, but they were released to play in the game. But their drill sergeant, who was a Carlton supporter, sent them on this massive 10-mile route march with full packs and everything on the morning of the game. So the three Collingwood stars, arguably our three best players, didn't arrive at the ground until about 5 minutes before the game. And surprise, surprise, we led early, faded in the last along with our stars, and Carlton won the flag. A couple of months later, everybody headed off. Ted, coincidentally enough, on the same boat as Doc. In the end, Doc and Paddy couldn't serve together, which was a great disappointment to both of them. By early 1916, all the Magpie ANZACs were over there, scattered across Europe, but mostly in France. And we're really lucky in a way because, as Harry said, it's hard to imagine what these guys were going through over there. But the footballers would send letters back to the club. They were really closely connected to the footy club still. And some of those letters were published in newspapers here in Australia. So we get, some of the letters have been republished, repurposed there, but I think it's more effective when you hear them. So just a couple of brief excerpts from some of those letters. And first, Nobes, you've got one for us.
From Private Jimmy Jackson in France in 1916. Well, I've heard some rows, but this place beats all. Guns going day and night. Can't get much sleep for them, but I'm getting used to it now. Some guns should wake the dead, and when these are going, there is no chance at all for slumber. Paddy Rowan will soon be in to see me. We are billeted about 1.5 miles behind the firing line, but it is just as bad as the front some days. When Fritz gets angry and sends over a few coal boxes, they play hell. One of our chaps got killed in his bed the other night, where I camped on the spot where George Chalice got killed.
Yep, so this is from Private Malcolm Doc 7 on October 1916, somewhere in France. Well, old man, the chap is among it over here, alright. You're alive 1 minute, God only knows where you'll be the next. Poor old Buff Huntley got blown out here yesterday. I was speaking to him only a short while before, and he was complaining of his ankle. But, poor fellow, his ankle will trouble him no more. The boys were asking me to send them something over for a keepsake. I'll only be too pleased, but they'll have to wait until we get out of this. For the only things I could send them from here would be some of Fritz's shells or some Huns' heads. And I am sure they would not like them. Well, I'll have to close it up as it's getting late, and Fritz is sending some big stuff over.
But the messages that came back home from the front weren't always ones of good luck or good news. Remember the letter that Nobes read from Jimmy Jackson saying that he was hoping to catch up with Paddy Rowan the next day. About a week after that story appeared, that letter appeared in the newspapers back home, Paddy Rowan was killed in France while in one of the trenches. Another soldier who was with him when he died wrote to the footy club. He knew he was a famous footballer and he wrote to us to tell exactly what had happened.
I'm enclosing details of how Paddy Rowan, Collingwood's crack follower, got fatally wounded. I was with Pat and some more chaps in a bombing post in one of the hottest corners of the Somme firing line. It rained shells and bullets here and we had some miraculous escapes, but fortunately no one was seriously hit till about half an hour before we got relieved when Pat got it. It was about 6 p.m. on the evening of Monday, December 4. Pat was stooping down, doing up his equipment, preparatory to leaving the line, when the shrapnel shell burst on the parapet about 3 feet above our heads. Pat gripped his sides and fell. Turning to us, he exclaimed, "I'm gone, goodbye lads, shake hands." He held out his hand, I gripped it. When he turned over and rolled in pain, I immediately sent for the stretcher bearers and with the aid of another lad, undid Pat's clothes and dressed his wound, which was a jagged one about 3 inches long in the small of his back near the left kidney. He complained of a dull pain in the stomach and said he felt himself running away there. The stretcher bearers took him to the dressing station, but I believe the doctor held out no hope from the first look. He died that night. and is buried near Troneswood in a soldier's battlefield cemetery. Pat was our platoon sergeant, and the boys of the 11th platoon felt his death keenly, as he was an honest, straightforward sport, a good game soldier, and he had full confidence in his men. I may say that he was calm and collected right through, and seemed to know as soon as he was hit, he was fatally wounded.
That was, even by the standards of the First World War, a particularly bad week for Collingwood. The day after Paddy died, a former Collingwood player called Peter Martin was hideously wounded in France. It took 18 months, but he eventually died of his wounds back in Australia. And 2 days after that, another former Magpie called Tommy Wright was killed instantly when struck by gunfire, also in France. These were ex-players, they had never been stars, and they hadn't played at Collingwood for more than a decade. So they were mourned, but it wasn't big news in the way that Paddy Rowan's death was. Paddy was a star, the vice-captain, and he was loved across football. So his loss was a big one. The club felt it hard, the competition felt it hard. And of course, Doc Seddon felt it particularly hard. He'd lost his best mate, the closest person he felt he had in the world. But there was still a water fight. And so Doc hung it out to the bitter end. In the end, he didn't come home till 1919, despite being wounded and gassed. He actually returned and played for Collingwood that year and played in a premiership. And if his horseshoe in 1917 helped inspire that flag, then I'm pretty sure that his return to the playing fields in 1919 inspired that year's as well. He then played a couple more years, retired, spent the next 20 years of his life devoted to the footy club in a variety of roles, chairman of selectors, basically ran the seconds. Over the years, I've had the good fortune to talk to families of many of the Collingwood ANZACs. A lot of them still support Collingwood, which is very cool. But even those who don't pay more attention to what happens on ANZAC Day. They notice what we do, what we say, everything that we do to honour them, particularly those who paid the ultimate price. So what we do as a footy club around ANZAC Day matters. We're not just playing to our hardcore fans, to the converted this week. The audience is wider, their reasons for engagement slightly different. You get to honour them on Tuesday by donning the special Guernsey and by doing what you do best, going out and playing. And this time the netballers get to join us, and it's going to be awesome to have you as part of ANZAC Day as well. And this is what you guys do best. The rest of the footy club, we get to honour them by all that we do in the lead up to and around the game. And part of that is telling their stories. That's what I like to do. Keeping their stories alive, because their stories are part of our story. They're part of us. And by honouring the Magpies who served, we honour all who served. And that is what ANZAC Day is all about.
Coming in as a 17-year-old, the first experience I got was sitting in the stands watching it, and the word that I used from all the stories was mateship. And I've just talked to a few boys before, like I'm lucky enough, I think this is my 17th ANZAC Day I get to play in. But it doesn't matter about form in this game or how we've ever come in, whether we're 1-4, Zip and 5, Essendon 5 and Dip, it's never really mattered. It's about the side who stays connected for the longest, plays the minutes as we speak about, and embraces that, and that always wins. As I said, it doesn't matter about form, and we're trying to build that this year. It's a group that just stays connected no matter what on Tuesday, gets the job done. And there's nothing better than embracing the occasion. Enjoy that when you warm up. The last post, look around at the amount of respect that gets paid to this day. But then our job as footballers and for the netballers is to play the minutes. And no matter what the scoreboard says, just stay connected and you'll walk off with your head held high.